Warning! Parental guidance. Adult situations. Not to be listened to by children under 18 years old.
Chapter 2. The English Side of the Family Tree. Dixon Albert Hawkins, 1799-1833. In the beginning, there was Ireland. Then came England. I can prove this because the English have tried to take over the world several times, fought with everyone out there, and invented Benny Hill, the restaurant at the end of the universe, taxes and politics. Life was tough in England before the red double-decker bus. There was sex aplenty, however, for all the young, strong men going off to wars to rape and pillage. This included Scotland, raping all those poor foreign girls and boys, moms and dads. Many of these brave men did not know which side of the fence they were on sexually, and sometimes got it wrong by raping the men and robbing the beautiful young foreign maidens of their financial worth. Watch Monty Python to understand these horrible times of extremely low intelligence. There was also much fun and naughty games back home on the English countryside, in the houses, rooms, barns, taverns, and virtually everywhere you went. The pimply-faced youth, who were either too young or too cowardly to join the army and fight for good old king and country, had all the local girls to themselves and used their time to the maximum, weakening the good old genes of England. Many of the best men in the country died in the wars in those days because that was the manly way to go. Civilized male death. You know what I mean. These numerous wars were fought over many, many years. First, it took ages to get there, and once somebody had blown the whistle to start the game, supposing some vicious opponent did not distribute your innards across the battlefield, it then took ages to get back home again after someone declared the war over. The English troops were really good on the battlefield and won their fair share of war spoils. The bounty included war souvenirs from stands or shops that were set up for this very occasion, and of course fair young maidens who weren't very clean and had vicious moms and dads like the Spanish. Many a good Englishman was left with his crown jewels hanging on a fence somewhere, the result of the wrath of a caring parent. Those who were spared this painful embarrassment were then subject to poisoning by French food or liver damage from the rough Portuguese wines of the day. England was in real trouble, and at this time along came my great-great-plus-grandfather into the world in the midst of this tragic era of English history. His name was Dixon Albert Hawkins, or Albert for short. His first name, shortened, namely Dick, was not used in the same sense as it is today, but just to be sure, his mom preferred Albert. He was born on May 11th, 1799, in a small seaside village called Brighton, on the southern coast of England. His two brothers and sister looked on in disbelief as the contents of Mom Hawkins's innards were made available for all to see. Between their screaming mother and Mildred Joan Lennon, the coffin-maker's wife, shouting orders and acting as midwife, out came this funny-looking thing that would be their baby brother. Albert, was born into this world in a lower middle-class existence, wrapped up in an old gunny sack instead of swaddling clothes. Albert muttered his first cry with the usual mix of insecurity and lack of nourishment that was normal in this generation of English children. As usual, his dad was down the pub, celebrating the new birth. He could not stand the sight of blood and had a bad habit of fainting. This was also why he was not with the army somewhere, slaughtering someone or being slaughtered himself. Being down at the pub at just the right time was one of the great English habits remembered from generation to generation, and this old way of life is still very much alive today. The new baby managed to get a small slurp from the breast once placed there by Ms. Lennon. That was all there was, as the other kids were still stealing from the same pantry while Mom was asleep. Food was not plentiful in this era, still isn't in England today. Albert grew into a small, quiet child, always waiting his turn to get the scraps from the table. Although Albert was in his third year, his dad still hadn't come back from the pub and wasn't expected shortly. The family had given up on his return a long time earlier and was rather happy to not have him around, as they stated on numerous occasions to anyone who had time to listen. Albert's mother often reminded their many neighbors that he was so useless that he could not have even organized a party in a paper bag. I use this modern expression, although they did not have paper bags in those days. What she actually said was not for the ears of our decent readers. Albert's mom was doing odd cleaning jobs to get by and feed her kids. Bob, his eldest brother, at the mature age of 6, was learning the art of pickpocketing and always helped Mom out with the food bill. Bob was clever, however. From the age of 8, Albert listened to his big brother's teachings on the exciting life of a pickpocket. He smartly used this information and without fail rattled through Bob's trousers just before midnight each night, hoarding only 1 or 2 of the several coins he usually found there. After a few years, he had a secret hole in the floor of his bedroom nearly half filled with hundreds and hundreds of coins he had quietly put away day after day. By the age of 15, Albert was a stocky kid who was 5 feet tall and weighed in at 130 pounds, 60-odd kilos for you metric guys out there. One day, a pretty 14-year-old damsel in distress fainted in a dark alley several yards in front of Bob, hoodwinking Albert's 18-year-old brother. Considering himself a gentleman of sorts, Bob naturally went to her aid, firstly to see what she had up her skirt, and then to try and find a money purse on her person. As he raised her dress and petticoats to see her female delights underneath, he was suddenly set upon by 4 much younger lads of his own kind. They quickly slit his throat before he could defend himself and took his trousers, as well as anything else of value, as the pretty little decoy stood up and dusted herself off. She was the younger sister of one of the robbers, and was not happy about this punk taking a free peek at her privates, and she kicked him his now useless groin before angrily departing the scene. A passing friend told my ancestor the sad news, and Albert's first priority was to look after his dearly departed brother. He ran over to the coffin maker and asked Mildred, the wife of the recently deceased coffin maker, to give him a good deal on a coffin for Bob. She was extremely happy to see him, as her business had taken a turn for the worse since the death of her husband several weeks earlier. Albert reserved the best coffin in stock and left the dark and dreary shop to collect his brother's body. On his way to the alley where the gruesome murder had been committed, he realized that his money trail had come to a sudden and unfortunate end and wondered what to do next. He had to rent a small wagon to get the half-naked, bloody body of his eldest brother back to the coffin lady, who was also the midwife who had helped bring him into this world. Once the heavy body had been placed in its new home for eternity, Albert returned to his room crying and, wiping his face with the back of his hand, slowly pulled all his secret coins out of the hole in the floor to count them. It took him the best part of 3 hours to count 7 years of daily activity, and he came to a slow realization that 19 pounds, 3 shillings and 7 pence was a lot of money. He immediately started to think of a way to change his destiny for the better. Albert and his family, as well as a couple of Bob's friends, laid him to rest in a grand manner in the local cemetery a few days later. That night, as he lay in bed, saddened from the funeral and really missing Bob's happy face for the first time, he wondered how the wife of the coffin maker was going to make it without her recently deceased husband, and an idea began to form in his clever young brain. The coffin maker's wife had held a very soft spot for Albert in her ample 48-inch bosom, since she had helped bring him into the world 16 years earlier. She had also lost 2 of her own children to coughing sickness and was very broody. Unfortunately for her, when her husband died, she knew very little about his business. Mildred and her 20-year-old daughter were all that remained of her once thriving and happy family. Albert, now about to turn 16 and thinking himself still a little young for the daughter, was a good-looking chap for those days, and most, if not all, the older boys were fighting in a foreign war somewhere. However, Penelope, the daughter of the ex-coffin maker, was only 4 years older than Albert, and had secretly had her eye on him for quite a while. His mom was doing better, which was an important thought in his plans. She had opened up a laundry service, and was gradually upgrading the home and family's quality of life. With a plan of action of going into business for himself set in his mind, it was time for Albert to make his move. For the last 2 years of his brother's life, Albert had watched him bring young tarts to his room, and from behind the curtains he watched the lustful proceedings with unabated interest. During the day, the rest of the family was out, and that had allowed the sneaky Albert to creep into Bob's room during the screams of high passion and rustle the tart's handbag and pockets for a couple of coins. He always searched his brother's trousers as well. Most of the time he only took a coin or two from each, and most of the time they were not missed. Unfortunately, sometimes the loss was discovered. Often he had seen fisticuffs in the street between the unhappy tart and his equally unhappy brother, each accusing the other of stealing his or her money. Albert had cleverly realized that the coffin maker's widow needed somebody to start building coffins again. Over the next couple of weeks he got himself invited to dinner several times and caressed Penelope's legs with his toes under the table. He finally got up enough courage and asked the widow for her daughter's hand in marriage. It was not against the rules to get married at the tender age of 16, as people tended to live such short lives, and it was also common in that day and age to be long dead by 40. His big day dawned just a month after his proposal. It was a quick wedding in the church, followed by a few drinks down at the pub with family and friends, followed by the nuptial necessities in her bedroom. Albert called them necessities, as he still had no practical experience in the matter. As he was getting into bed with his new bride, Penelope, his new mother-in-law entered the room and proceeded to explain the birds and bees to her daughter, and apologized to him about not having the time to explain the proceedings to his new bride earlier. Penelope went white, and her face registered total shock when she learned what big thing her new husband had and where in her body he was going to put it. Mildred then explained to Albert how desperately she wanted to have grandchildren and that he would be the one to produce them. She would look after them while he ran the coffin business. Penelope nearly fainted as Mildred suddenly jerked her nightgown over her head, ripped off her scanty underwear, forced her innocent legs apart, and ordered Albert to get on with it. Now Albert was pretty experienced from watching his brother countless times, and as he watched his mother-in-law open up his new bride's legs to his lusty gaze, he felt generations of strength fill his loins, and he hit upon the flower of Penelope's innocence with a determination few have ever seen. His lust was so intense that his mother-in-law was pushed against the wall and had to hold on for dear life, still helping to keep the legs open for him. For Penelope, the pain of generations of manhood was overwhelming, pushing inside her like a wild bull. Slowly the pain changed into feelings of delight, and instead of trying to push Albert away, he pulled him closer with meows of delightful ecstasy. The meows turned into screams of passion, so intense that her mother had let go of her legs and watched in shock. She was so close to the sweating bodies that she felt like getting into the fray herself and began tearing the robes off her strong body. She had to stop herself from jumping right into the middle and on top of her very new son-in-law. There was nothing she missed, and regarding the highest groans from Albert and Penelope, she smiled at the thought of the beautiful grandchildren to come. Sweat formed everywhere on the three bodies as passion mounted, and Mildred was right over the battle, watching everything very closely. Albert, in the middle of a parry that any fencer would have been proud of, opened his eyes to the very unusual scene of his mother-in-law's naked and massive pink breasts glistening with sweat above his nose, and produced two of those most wanted children right there and then. He filled Penelope so much that she screamed in ecstasy as her body shuddered and she dug holes in his arms with her nails. She had never felt so much pleasure in her whole life. In a daze, her body transformed into a very lazy state, and she felt like she was floating in a pool of rich, warm liquid. In all, this had taken several minutes of sweat, screams, and moans. Albert was exhausted. Penelope was gone, floating on very high clouds, and her mother silently collected what was left of her clothes, gave Albert the sweetest smile possible, covered her ample sweaty body, and left the room. Albert rested his head on the pillow and thought about the events of the past hour. His new wife was already asleep, nestled up snugly next to him.
Caw, no wonder Bob did this with a different tart every day,
he said to himself. Albert felt drained but alive as never before, and his first time was something he would never forget for the rest of his life. As he lay there beside his sleeping wife, his mind wandered to the business at hand. His deceased father-in-law, Penelope's dad, had set up a very good business manufacturing coffins by hand. Unfortunately, booze and sickness had gotten the better of him and weakened his immune system. The last bout of coughing sickness had taken its toll, reducing him to a resident of one of his own handmade coffins. Albert's lifetime achievement of carefully putting away every stolen penny was now going to bear fruit. In those years, 10 English pounds was a year's income for a successful person. His mother-in-law was not a businesswoman and had very little interest in the family business except as a means to feed the family. Albert was extremely rich by the standards of the lower class anywhere in England. Filled with ideas of success and enjoying a peaceful calm in his whole body from the evening's activities, Albert carefully wriggled out from his beautiful wife's clutches, covered his naked body with his now rumpled shirt, and went downstairs.
So, you didn't want seconds, did you?
His mother-in-law quipped as he entered the warm kitchen.
She's plain knackered out.
Albert replied.
If the house fell down, it wouldn't wake her.
Well, I was so impressed with your performance, young man, that you can flirt with me any time you want.
His mother-in-law offered, her best occasion smile glued to her lips.
Let's get down to business.
Albert stated, looking down her cleavage and noticing that most of her equipment was still showing.
Come sit next to me. Let's talk.
She purred. Albert pulled up a kitchen chair and sat beside her. Mildred, who was in her 34th year, was getting a little old for this period of history, but she had a strong body and was still reasonably attractive. Before he could stop her, she quickly slid her hand up his bare leg, under his crumpled shirt ends, and put her warm hand where he least expected her to leave it. Naturally rising to the occasion, Albert's face rushed headlong into a dark rosy colour, but it felt so good that he didn't try to remove it.
I wanted to sell me the coffin business,
Albert whispered.
Give me enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and do me once a week what you did up there to my daughter tonight, and you've got yourself a deal.
She replied.
You see, Bert left me too early, in the prime of my life, and all the older men are at the wars. There's not much to choose from round here at the moment.
What will Penelope say?
Asked a shocked Albert, his face suddenly going from bright red to deathly white.
Why, nothing. She is totally innocent. Such a good girl. She won't mind me having a bit of you when I want, if I explain it to her.
The older lady smiled, holding on tightly.
I can give you £15 for the coffin business, as well as a small annual allowance to keep you going.
Albert whispered, struggling hard to think straight, as the blood was still leaving his head and travelling in a downward direction.
Remember, I have my own mother to think about.
He mumbled, feeling his whole body getting increasingly weaker.
Of course, your darling mother is important, so give me 12 of your £15 and an annual income of £3, and I will live happily, expecting your visit once a week.
Mildred concluded. Albert couldn't believe he had gotten out of the negotiation so lightly, and through the haze of pleasure the older lady was invoking in him, he realized that he could be onto something good here.
What do I tell Penelope?
Albert grunted in a deep and trembling voice.
She will do as I say, and I'm sure that she won't mind sharing you once a week. She wants me to be happy, doesn't have a jealous streak in her body,
replied Penelope's honest and caring mom.
Now you lie back, young fella, and I am going to show you a few things you can teach my daughter.
For the second time that day, Big Dick, as his jealous brother Bob had decided to call him one day while swimming in the local lake miles outside town, had to satisfy a lady with an excellent performance. Albert learned that the namesake of his nickname could do the same strokes as his brother Bob, who had inadvertently taught him throughout his young life that it was an advantage to have this part of his anatomy in good working order. Entangled in a massive heap on the floor and gasping for breath, the two bodies noticed that Penelope had sneaked down the stairs and was sitting completely naked and watching them with fascination. Instead of a look of disgust, she had a look of open interest, because what they were doing was still totally new to her, even at the age of 20.
Mum, what are you doing with Albert? Looks a bit different from what I just did with him.
She asked softly.
I am teaching him all I can teach him, so that you can learn from him on the morrow. But tonight you go upstairs and go back to sleep.
her mom stated with authority in her voice.
Thanks for my wedding day, Mum. And be gentle with him, for he is my brand new and darling husband.
She leaned over, gave them both a kiss on the cheek, and departed for bed. The following morning, a stiff and very bruised Albert walked home to the rest of his family across town. He sat his mom down and explained to her that she was going to come into an extra fortune of £5. This money would allow her to move into a better neighborhood, with fewer thieves and tarts hanging around. With her laundry income added to the lump sum, and a small income from Albert to replace older brother Bob's pennies, she and the rest of the family would never be hungry again. His mother broke down crying and kissed her son, hugging him over and over again. After packing his belongings and making sure he hadn't missed any coins in the hole in the floor, Albert paid his mother the promised money, which ended up as a large pile of pennies on the kitchen table. With hugs and kisses from the remainder of his family, he left the house. With a suitcase in one hand and a heavy bag filled with hundreds and hundreds of coins hung around the shoulder of the other, Albert set out for married life. Whistling, he stopped a cabbie for the first time and arrived in style, his waiting bride watching and waving out of a window for him. On the way, he promised himself and all the descendants to come, including me, that they would never want for money again. I wish it had held true. Waking up his tired mother-in-law, he took a while counting coins onto her kitchen table and paid her the princely sum of £15. He then gave her until midday to leave the apartment above the coffin-making business and move into new accommodations down the street. That night, after his still aching body had satisfied his now eager wife, Albert dozed off to sleep with the realization that life had given him more than most guys ever got. And if he acted wisely, he could set up a game plan to stay on top for the rest of his life. 9 months later to the day, a beautiful set of twins came into the world, delivered by their grandmother. The whole family came together at Albert's house, and not like his dad, who had celebrated in a pub when Albert was born, and celebrated for the next 48 hours. By then, the coffin-making business was in full swing with enough business at hand. There were even a few deceased bodies hanging around, waiting for the production line to produce their final resting places. With a team of 7 carpenters, Albert was working double shifts to keep up with the current death rate. A few weeks later, the not-so-great news arrived. My next ancestor was about to enter the world. No, not from Penelope, as she had just had her twins, but from her mother. Albert had previously noticed the increase of his mother-in-law's midriff on his weekly visit, and she had told him not to bother visiting her for the next 3 or so months. The news nearly drove Albert to hit the pub for a week, but his mother-in-law was as happy as a pig playing in the mud. His mother had a few questions to ask her son, mind you, when she heard about the pregnancy and asked where it came from. After explaining to his mother that he was old enough to look after himself and reminding her about the small fortune she had received, he managed to keep the gossip within the family walls. Anyway, to get a knotted story into a novel, my next great-great plus granddad arrived a few months later, weighing 12 pounds, 15 ounces. If Mildred hadn't been so well built, Albert didn't think she would have made it. It was like giving birth to a donkey. The baby came out screaming and kicking, and many of the neighbors that came around to watch the birth vowed that he would definitely be a famous politician by the amount of noise he managed to put out. Albert was surprised to find that his mother-in-law had already named the baby after him. No, not Albert, but the shortened version of Dixon, namely Dick. It was not long before the woman of the family noticed tremendous growth in the little one and expanded his name to Big Dick. This sent Albert's mother's cheeks into many shades of red, and Big Dick's legacy was sealed. 5 years later, one of those years that no one really wants to remember arrived. A horrible plague hit the area, and Albert had to just about strip the neighboring forests for enough wood to fill the needs of the dead lying everywhere. Many times he had to search the pockets of the dead and also the remaining family members of the dead to get enough money to pay for the coffins that were flying out of the factory's production line. Even with 21 carpenters working double shifts, he couldn't keep up. Bodies were falling into the coffins as they made them, and production had to be faster. These were very bad times. Even Mildred dropped dead on the way to the outhouse one Sunday morning during church, which released Albert from his obligations to his strong mother-in-law. His own poor mother went as well, and so did the rest of his family, including his and Penelope's twins. Penelope survived a terrible fever that ranted and raved within her for several days, and was told by the doctor she would not bear children again. Poor Albert was left with a very sick wife and a very healthy Big Dick, who was starting to eat him out of house and home. As suddenly as it had come, the plague went. A large army marched through Brighton on their way to one of the wars in France, and the disease figured out that these guys were better to eat than what was left in Brighton. It followed the healthy men onto the ships, and not one person died of the plague after the army left. Albert was by now the richest man in the village. Granted, there were not many left after the plague. He started to worry that someone might find some of the hard-earned cash he had stashed away in every nook and cranny of the house. The floorboards in all the rooms were now uneven due to the bulk of the money, and if you looked carefully at night, the light from the lamp made the holes in the floor and the many holes in the wall glisten. Big Dick was now 8, a growing lad, and upon Penelope's return to health, Albert decided it was time to move on to greater pursuits. There was a very expensive standard of living and a very high quality of tarts in London due to something called tourism. Very expensive pubs and extremely expensive houses were also a result of this phenomenon. Albert decided that this tourism stuff made London a good place to move to and start a coffin business.
If everything's so expensive in the city of London,
Albert mentioned to Penelope one night while enjoying Big Dick's 9th birthday dinner.
they should be more than happy to pay me for good quality coffin work. Even though their quality of life is better, they still have to die, you know.
Well, since my mother's death and the loss of my babies, I don't want to stay here anymore. This house holds too many ghosts for me.
Penelope answered.
Albert, darling, we have so much money in these walls. How are we going to get it all to London without being robbed by the highwaymen I've always heard about?
I'll think of a way, my sweet.
Albert returned, picking his teeth with a chicken bone and looking over at his son, who was finishing off the rest of the large bird like a hungry fox. There was not much left in Brighton to live for, so he set about planning his move. Albert spent many hours pondering the question presented to him by his wife. He and Big Dick even spent a few days on the London road working out how to get a large supply of money from Brighton to wherever they were going. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, Albert came up with a grisly plan. Penelope was aghast at what she would have to do to get to London, but anything was better than staying in that old town inhabited by ghosts. After placing 6 of his biggest and best coffins on 2 of their toughest wagons one night, Albert, with Big Dick's help, filled them with the money from under the floorboards and walls of the house. As the coffins were packed, the building seemed to screech and give out long moans of relief as the weight was removed from its old framework. Albert gave Big Dick 3 English coins of his own, acquired from the sale of house and business, to the last 8 of the carpenters who had managed to survive the recent plague. When it was time to leave, Albert had everything well planned out. They had left several inches empty inside each coffin, and here they squashed a poor unsuspecting dead human's remains over the pile of money, hiding the family fortune completely from prying eyes. If opened, nobody in his right mind would want to dig deeper into the coffins. All this work was done to ward off any interested highway robbers. They packed the rest of their belongings on top of the coffins, and with 6 horses pulling each wagon, left town that very morning, with the 2 wagons softly moaning under the weight. With Penelope by Albert's side, and Big Dick now old enough to handle horses on the rear wagon, my ancestral family moved on to the big time. The town of Brighton would miss them, and all did, except the 8 carpenters who perished a few days later when the building they had purchased from Albert totally collapsed just before lunchtime from the lack of a supporting structure. They all went with a loud crash of timber that day during the busiest part of the morning as the aging building realized it could no longer stand up. By this time, Albert and his family were nearly halfway to London. Albert and his family never had trouble on the road. Any time they suspected any other people in the vicinity of their wagons, they kept up a constant bell ringing that warned the other travellers that something was very wrong, and they had better stay away. Many times, funny-looking men with weird-looking cloths covering their faces came out to inspect the two wagons, but all quickly left once the rich stench of rotting flesh hit their nostrils. The human remains were now well on their way to full decomposition, and it took Penelope days to get used to the horrible smell of the rotting bodies. It wasn't that she hadn't smelt the rich, musty smell of death before. The smell had often been pretty rough to work with while getting dead bodies into coffins, fast enough to clear the air, but at least she could walk away from it. Here the smell always followed her, just a few feet behind. Albert had deliberately planned to complete the trip in midsummer, which would give them the best rotten, smelly bodies due to the heat. Those remains, now on a hot and dusty road for some days, were as ripe as ever possible. One morning at the end of the first week, Penelope couldn't take any more of the repulsive smell, and Albert suggested that she walk ahead of the two wagons, ringing the bell that had been part of the overall plan. As soon as people saw her ringing the bell and looking disgustingly dirty, they seemed to disappear into thin air. For the rest of the trip, Penelope always walked a few yards ahead of the wagon. Toward the end of the second week on the road, the smell got so bad that even highway robbers miles ahead had been warned of the disgusting stench about to come their way from other highway robbers escaping it, and they stayed away. Word made it to the outskirts of the city of London of the foul-smelling wagons with the weird and very smelly lady ringing a bell. Most of the remaining highway robbers decided to leave for their annual summer vacation at the coast earlier than usual, since the smelly bunch of wagons were ruining their business. The road emptied rapidly for miles ahead once the sound of Penelope's bell was heard. A week later, the first buildings of London appeared over the horizon, and the extremely smelly family, with their two very smelly wagons, began their descent into the city. The great city of London was nothing more than a large rat hole in those days. Although the city was constructed of small, poorly assembled buildings made mostly of wood, with no sewage system or running water. The 100,000 people living there thought it was the peak of civilization. Once in the city, things got a little better. The streets were very narrow, and the people, having been forewarned of the approaching smell, began throwing their washing water out of the windows over the travellers as they passed beneath. Albert uncovered the tops of the wagons, realizing that the water would surely get rid of the smell as it washed the separating particles of human remains into the street. Albert was not stupid. He was my ancestor, after all, and his disguise was working. He had moved the princely sum of just under £697 from Point Brighton to London without a threat of being robbed. They finally managed to get past outer London. The wagons were totally soaked, and a large portion of the human remains had been left on the streets behind them. Each wagon and driver must have been doused at least a couple 100 times before they turned onto the wider streets of the better areas of the city. A sign on one of the street corners told them that they were now in the suburb of South Kensington. To Albert, that sounded like a nice place. Albert and Big Dick stopped the wagons and began knocking on all the doors in the street. One very smart gentleman, holding a kerchief to his nose, told them about a house on the next street that might be available for purchase, as the owner had died a couple months earlier and it was currently empty. When they arrived at the house, two young gentlemen were loudly arguing outside the front door. Albert got off the wagon and silently closed in on the men, listening to their conversation.
"We need to get rid of Mother's house immediately,"
said the one man.
"Mother would not like that, Peter. She loved this house, and times are hard right now. Who are we going to get to buy it? It's far bigger than most families need,"
added the other.
"Well, there's money in it for us if we do,"
butted in the one called Peter.
"She left it to the two of us and Mary. I believe it's worth more than that publican offers for it. He looks like a nasty man to me. Mother paid £15 for the house all those years ago."
Cut in the other one.
"I agree, Martin,"
added the other man, trying to get a word in edgeways, but his seemingly upset brother interrupted him.
"I know it's older now, but I don't see why we should sell it to that ugly old publican for £12, just because that's all he can afford. That's a load of old codswallop. I believe it's worth £18 at least.
Continued the troubled young Martin.
I agree with you there again, brother.
Peter continued.
If we take his £12 and split it 3 ways, that's only £4 apiece. But the way I look at it is, who else other than that publican would be interested in such a large house? It's twice the size of all the others on the street, and old Mrs. Masterson's house 2 doors down sold for £12 a few months ago to that young bookbinder fella, Bernard Shaw.
I agree,
Martin replied.
but the question still remains. How do we find someone who will give us more than £4 apiece for Mum's house here?
I will.
Chimed in my very smelly ancestor, walking up to the 2 gentlemen.
I apologise for listening in on your family conversation, but you gentlemen were speaking in such loud tones. I may not look like much a man of wealth right now, but I'll put £15 in good English money in your hands for this house, furnished and in good order.
Albert stated, noticing that both men suddenly drew out white handkerchiefs, held them close to their noses, and looked at him with disgust.
You do not look like a gentleman who could afford even the front door of the house, sir.
The man named Peter scoffed.
You stink worse than any ruffian I have ever smelt before.
Martin chimed in.
I agree totally with both of you gentlemen, but, you see, my family and I have just travelled from Brighton in the south with the very purpose of moving to London, and we have the money to purchase your mother's house in our wagons. I'd like to find an inn where my wife, son and I can wash up. Then I would like to make an appointment with you for this time tomorrow afternoon, so that we can go over the finer details of this property.
Both young gentlemen looked him over from head to foot, still holding their kerchiefs to their noses.
How can you satisfy us that you can afford to buy our mother's grand old house?
Asked one.
Son!
Albert shouted over to Dick, still sitting on the second wagon.
You have those 3 gold coins from the sale of the Brighton house in your pocket, don't you?
Yes, Dad, came the reply.
Well, get off the wagon and bring them over here.
He ordered.
Okay, Dad.
The young boy replied, jumping off the wagon and strutting up to his father, holding out the 3 very dirty but still glistening large English gold pieces.
You see, gentlemen, just in my son's one pocket are 3 recognisable gold coins, or the equivalent of 6 quid, nearly half the payment of your mother's house.
Albert stated, looking at the white and still shocked faces of the 2 young brothers.
So, meet with us tomorrow, right here at the same time. Also, bring a bill of sale signed by yourselves and Mary, whoever she is, and we can do business. I give you my word as a gentleman that you will not recognise us tomorrow.
They wouldn't. Albert, Penelope and Big Dick found a very smart hotel a few streets down that accepted them immediately upon presentation of the same gold coins, on the condition that they clean up in the staff washrooms behind the hotel before entering the posh establishment. It took hours of washing and repeated baths and steaming hot water for each of them to finally get rid of the smell of death that hung around them. Servants from the hotel brought bucket after bucket of hot water, collected their smelly clothes gingerly with sticks, and burned them in a bonfire built for the occasion in the courtyard. A group of unemployed young men from the surrounding streets were brought in by the hotel to wash down the horses and wagons. A now clean Big Dick, wearing borrowed clothes, kept an eye on the coffins, still on the back of the wagons, while they were being washed down. Tailors were brought in and offered double if they could sew a couple of sets of clothing for each family member by the next morning. It seemed impossible, but for that much money, they got measurements and rushed off to their places of business to start work. Meanwhile, the owner of the inn found them enough clothes to make them presentable. By nightfall, the Hawkins family of Albert, Penelope, and Big Dick smelled like normal human beings again, and they were clean enough to be directed to the best suite in the hotel. Penelope was very relieved, and over a fine dinner in their suite, she told the 2 men that she would bathe every day for the rest of her life. After dinner, Albert and Big Dick returned to the 2 wagons, now locked up in one of the hotel's private stables, and, After asking the exhausted servants outside the door to leave, they walked in, locking it behind them, and carefully opened one of the coffins. Albert grabbed a bucket and filled it with the muck and filth from inside. He filled it with dirty gold pieces, notes and coins, and dumped them all into the bath, having filled it with hot water from the buckets. He then searched through the piles of money in the warm water until he came across several gold pieces. He cleaned them extra carefully, as one of them was to be presented to the owner of the hotel. Once they had put a large amount of coins and paper money in to soak, they left the stable, locking the door behind them, and went to look for the man in question.
Sir, this is payment for all you have done for us. Hopefully, this will include a week in your finest suite with 3 meals a day. It should also cover payment to all those young men and women who helped us clean up. If you don't mind, I'd like to rent the private stable our wagons are in for the whole week. Also, I believe that our family's new clothing should come to a total of about 8 shillings. Could you pay the tailors when they arrive on the morrow and have them directed up to our suite?
Of course, sir. I'd be glad to, sir.
The happy landlord replied.
I'll also need a guard posted outside the stable 24 hours a day, and only myself and my son should be allowed in.
He added,
I'll get 6 policemen with muskets from the local police station to guard your stable, sir. Will 2 at a time be enough?
Albert nodded.
The policemen will make sure that the remains of your dearly departed are left alone.
The landlord assured him. Albert smiled at the remark about his dearly departed and added,
I appreciate that, sir. Those family members are still very valuable to us, and if you need any more funds, just let me know.
The next morning the washed money smelled better after lying overnight in the bath filled with bath salts. The 2 policemen outside had been introduced to the renters of the stable, and Albert promised them 6 pence each in addition to the wages offered by the innkeeper if they refused entry to anyone other than Big Dick and himself for the next week. Penelope was definitely not going near the stables again. Albert and his son dried off each and every note and coin. Sunlight streamed in through the 2 windows on the side wall of the stables, and the heat had dried the notes by the time the tailors returned for their first fitting of the morning. By 2 that afternoon, the tailors returned for the 3rd and final time, and the Hawkins family, for the first time in history, were well dressed enough to look like a lady and 2 wealthy gentlemen. The family looked grand from head to toe, and even the hotel staff clapped as Albert and Big Dick left the hotel. The tailors left after getting orders from Penelope for 3 more sets of clothing to be delivered within the next few days. She stayed behind with a couple of female hotel guests to look at cloth for her new wardrobe. Of course, Peter and Martin did not recognize the 2 well-dressed men when they walked up to them exactly a minute before the meeting time at 5 on the dot.
I don't believe it.
Peter stuttered, holding a hand to his mouth as Albert introduced himself to the young men. After introductions, the 4 men went inside, and for an hour they viewed the house for sale. It was grand. There was enough room for a coffin business downstairs, and plenty of room to live upstairs. Albert paid the 2 young gentlemen cash for the house, which also had stables in the rear, and he was happy to hear that there was an upmarket bathhouse next door.
Penelope can use the modern-style bathhouse for as long as she wants.
Albert told Big Dick. I think we will all use it every day for the next few weeks, Dad. Big Dick laughed. After moving, cleaning and stashing the money away in their new stables, and finally burying the lingering tiny remains of their relatives from the 6 coffins in the nearest cemetery, they sold the still smelly horses and wagons to a coffin business in East Kensington and moved into their new abode. Albert purchased the bathhouse for Penelope, as well as the house on the far side of the bathhouse. This was a smaller, but still a beautiful house that Albert needed to purchase from the ex-bathhouse owner along with the bathhouse. Albert had decided that it was a better place to set up his new coffin business than having the noise and smell below their living quarters. Funny how ideas change. None of the 3 now well-dressed and very clean Hawkins were excited about getting into the smelly coffin-making business again. One fine morning a few weeks later, Albert was sitting outside on his porch and thinking about his future plans. Mrs. Smith, an elderly widow whom he had often acknowledged as she passed, stopped and asked if he minded speaking with her. Since the elderly Mrs. Smith would be a potential client if he got into the coffin business again, he quickly got up and walked over to her. After general introductory formalities concerning current weather conditions and the like, he explained his old trade in Brighton and his ideas of starting a coffin-making business in the house on the other side of the bathhouse. She seemed very interested in what he had to say. Several days later, she walked past and wished him good morning, looking like she needed to ask him something again.
What can I do for you today, Mrs. Smith?
Albert asked kindly.
Well, Mr. Hawkins, to cut a long story short, I would like you to hold a little of my money so that I can bank on my coffin being paid for when I go.
She stated. That one statement started the cogs in Albert's mind working overtime, and it ended with a new banking institution. This remark of Mrs. Smith led Albert to think for days and days on his porch as he paced the ground at the back of the house by his stables, where all the money was stashed. He didn't talk to anybody for a week and kept drawing pictures in the sand with a stick. Once he had sorted out his new idea of paying in advance, he set the plan in motion. Albert ordered Big Dick to go with him, and for the next 3 days he went out and got the strongest materials he could find. With a team of men, it took 2 months before he had built a massive steel vault inside the smaller house. It had a door so thick that a pack of wild men couldn't knock it down. The house had also been cleared of many of the inside walls and was now a large, open-plan structure, 2 levels high. The new vault took up a good part of the rear of the ground floor of the house. During the building of the 50-ton vault, he had thought up several names for his new business, and Hawkins Deposit and Banking was the name that all 3 family members finally decided on. Albert's idea was to get payments for coffins in advance, and then build the coffins once his customers died. He had realized that the people wanted him to protect their money so they could die a decent death with a decent burial.
Well,
Albert said to himself during the first day as he sat behind his new desk in his new office.
maybe I could look after all their money. I could let my future customers deposit and withdraw what money they needed, when they needed it, for a small fee. Why start a new coffin-making business when I could subcontract for a small remuneration? The smelly burial business out to the existing coffin makers who bought my horses and wagons off me, crossing East Kensington. When my clients die, relatives will come looking for the remaining cash. I could charge them a fee, take it out, and then charge them again to put it back in under my own name.
The banking institution as we know it today was formed. Penelope was delegated as the person to tell the customers how much it would cost for the bank services. Albert called her the teller. Big Dick was now 9 years old, 5 feet tall, and weighed in at 165 pounds. He was the eyes and ears of his dad for any naughty nonsense when Albert had to open the massive door of the vault to pay in or collect funds for customers. Albert called him a security guard. Albert was in charge of the marketing and gave away brand new coffin handles sold to him by the lads in East Kensington for new accounts opened. They didn't have toasters or waffle irons in those days. Boy, did business prosper. After 3 years, he had never had to build a single coffin, and hundreds of clients left their financial savings tucked away in his vault. Hawkins Deposit and Banking was certainly a place where you could depend on your money staying where it was meant to stay. The best part about Albert's plan was that many of his clients died without telling their loved ones where the money was, or kept it such a secret that no one knew they had it in the first place. And that made his paper and coin assets grow, much like many well-known firms of today. Their lives were now that of the upper class. Servants, parties, fine and fancy clothes, and everything they needed. Big Dick was even given his own carriage, 2 horses and a driver for his 12th birthday. 5 years later came the Kensington fire of 1834. It is quite a famous fire, but not as famous as the Great Fire of London that nearly burned down the whole city. It started with Mary Smothers Wright. She fell asleep with the window open and didn't wake up when her oil lamp was knocked over by the curtain, which also knocked over a half-full bottle of highly flammable substance. The bottle broke into 1,000,000 pieces after falling a considerable distance and connecting with Mrs. Smothers Wright's head. She was sleeping directly below the window to catch the cooling midsummer breeze. This did not help her chances of ever waking up again, as bottles in those days were very heavy, and certainly must have done her thick skull some major damage. All her neighbours called her thick-skulled anyway, because of her attitude towards them. The spilled substance caught fire immediately. I'm sure Mary would have been thankful that the bottle was as heavy as it was, as it probably spared her any conscious agony when she exploded into a ball of flames. Her underskirts were cumbersome, despite it being the middle of summer, and there was enough combustible material to set in motion a large blaze that turned everything that lay in its path into flames. Being one of those very rare, dry English days, the fire spread quickly, and within minutes neighbours had to jump from any available window or door and scurry with their skirts high in the air for cover. This fiery incident was happening only 3 blocks away from Hawkins' deposit and banking. The second block next to the origin of the fire caught alight within minutes. This fire was already a mean machine on a mission of destruction, and it caught so many people by surprise that most didn't even get a word out of warning before they had to flee. Albert was busy in the outhouse at the time, doing what most people did, caught up in the news and gossip of the daily newspaper. It was funny that he had just ordered the installation of their first inside bathroom the day previous. As he exited the commode, he was surprised to notice the 18-year-old Miss Mackay from next door, running past at full gallop, wearing nothing more than her lower set of undergarments, and with her little white breasts drumming a hasty beat against her chest. This drumming caught Albert's eye, as it certainly was a moment to behold. Unfortunately, this gave the rushing monster the time it needed to grab onto the wooden outhouse, and with a bellow of strength, it moved itself to the main building through the body of the gaping Albert. Albert instantaneously perished in the strength of the onslaught, with the beautiful vision of Miss Mackay imprinted on his mind. Penelope did not witness Albert's quick demise, but walking towards the door of the vault, he suddenly noticed the side wall of the bank, right where the vault door was situated, start to smoke and then erupt into flames. The giant vault's door was wide open, and she realized there was a layer upon layer of paper money, as well as important documents in sudden danger. She rushed to the heavy door, and with all her might began to close it. Unfortunately, there was a large pile of paperwork on shelves on the outside wall of the vault, between her and the hungry flames. The extreme heat ignited these papers like a small bomb, causing Penelope's clothing to burst into flames, and without further warning, the flames entered the still open vault and began consuming the combustible materials inside. Penelope did not even have time to scream, as the floor below the vault splintered, gave way, and swept her, the heavy vault, and the amassed wealth into the feet of slimy mud that had built up over many years under the house. The vault was so heavy that the ground below gave way for many muddy feet before halting its fall on a large underground boulder. The slippery, slimy, sodden soil then pushed itself back into its original position, covering the roof of the safe, which was nearly 10 feet under the furiously burning structure that was all that remained of the building. Nobody knew exactly how many coins and large amounts of cash there were in the safe, except for the already burnt bodies of Albert and Penelope Hawkins. The address was 19 Smithers Street, South Kensington, if you want to go and dig it up, as to this day the vault has never been found. Big Dick was lucky. He had just finished depositing a small amount of the company's money into the new but much smaller strong room in the recently renovated second Hawkins Deposit and Banking Building. Albert had just set up the second branch on Grosvenor Street in the centre of the Waterloo area. Luckily, this area was on the other side of the river. Big Dick sniffed the air, smelt the fire, and walked outside to take a look. He was shocked to see the whole northwest side of the river engulfed in flames that reached up into the sky, and he realized that Kensington, as he knew it, would never be the same again. Days later, after the fire had emptied itself upon the riverfront and the molten earth had cooled down, he managed to walk back to the remains of Smithers Street and spent hours trying to find the exact location of his old house, the bathhouse and the bank. It was all gone, and everything had completely changed with the fire. The only items he could recognize were semi-melted pieces of the free coffin handles that the bank had given away with each new account. Being a sweet and loving child, Big Dick fell down and openly wept for his parents, and after many hours he returned to the new bank. Poor Big Dick had no idea what to do. He had not inherited his father's insight into the opportunities the banking industry had to offer. Just then, another lad about the same age walked past the open door and saw Big Dick visibly upset. Frederick Barclay, himself being of newly acquired wealth, as his father had died the week before and left his only child a reasonable sum of money, sat down next to Big Dick and shared in this open display of loss. On one side of the building in which the new branch was situated was one of the oldest pubs in the city, the Goat's Head, and it invitingly beckoned Big Dick and Fred Barclay to partake in its quality merchandise for the rest of the day. The next morning, Big Dick returned to the bank, sat down at the never-used manager's desk, and began to think. At that time in 1834, Big Dick was a massive lad for 17 years old, standing just under 6 feet 2 inches and weighing in at 235 pounds of menacing youth. He opened the vault and counted 191 pounds, 7 shillings and 9 pence. He owed the pub 7 shillings for the food and drink downstairs, and for the lovely Sarah he owed another £0.5 for many soft, intimate nights before the fire. After several days of discussion between the two men, Fred Barclay purchased a large share of the bank from Big Dick for the sum of £100. He was going to change the name of the company to Barclay's Bank. Big Dick's deal with his friend was this. Fred Barclay would run the bank, and Big Dick would leave most of his money in the bank for safekeeping and end up a silent partner. Big Dick and Fred added Fred's investment money to his 190 remaining pounds from the original bank, and he kept a number of gold coins and notes that Fred gave him for future use. My young ancestor was under much stress, and on the eve of his last night in London for a while, he got mad when he found another man with his best girl, cut a hand off that little scoundrel, and had to depart rather urgently. The last anyone heard of this sad and lonely lad for 3 years was when Fred received a note from a friend of a friend of a friend, months later, telling him that his partner had evaded the police and had enlisted with the English army. After 6 months of training in Portsmouth, Big Dick was sent to fight the latest war of the French. Those French vermin had called the English roast beefs again, as well as swearing at their mothers and calling them nasty names, and the English were not going to stand for that.